The Russian-Indian summit between Prime Minister Modi of India and President Putin of Russia has now concluded in Moscow. There's been a joint statement and an agreed plan to develop Indian-Russian economic relations all the way to 2030 and beyond. And there's been a whole list of programs that the Russians and the Indians are going to work jointly together with. So I'm just taking now a list of headlines from the Russian news agency TASS. They report, for example, that Russia and India will continue energy sphere cooperation. They report that that the Russians are going to increase fertilizer exports to India. They say that Putin and Modi discussed their use of national payment systems. I'll read what the statement says, and it's been provided by Deputy Head of the Russian Presidential Administration, Maxim Oreshkin. Certainly, the use of national payment systems was discussed. This is an important element of trade support, infrastructure, interaction in general, and not only trade in goods and investment interaction. There is also an arrangement on interaction between the central banks on the issue of accepting national payment cards. A separate paragraph in strategic guidelines is exactly dedicated to the use of national currencies where achievements are great. 70% of trade turnover is already serviced by national currencies. The most interesting part of this comment is that India is going to start accepting the Mir card. The United States has been trying to impose sanctions on banks and financial institutions around the world that process Mir card payments, Russian Mir card payments. India, it looks like, is about to drive a massive coach and horses through this attempted sanctions wall. That will put the United States in a very difficult position. Do they start sanctioning Indian banks, which might be geopolitically very difficult to do, given that the United States is anxious to develop a relationship with India, which it sees as a potential ally against China. So anyway, that is a major step that the Indians are taking. They're going to, as Oreshkin says, start agreeing to the interaction of national payment cards, accepting national payment cards. By the way, I ought to say that from my own knowledge, India is very much a favored destination for Russians. The Russians have long had very strong romantic attachments to India. They like to travel to India. Many of them go there. Some of them spend long periods of time there. They're interested in Indian culture. And there's been a steady flow of Russian tourists towards India, even if this cannot for the moment match the massive flood of tourists from Russia that go to Turkey and Egypt. But it's likely to increase. The key areas of immediate development, of course, is oil, fertilizer, and grain, but it seems that the Indians and the Russians are also interested in cooperation on quantum computing, and here we go. Russia, India explore cooperation in quantum technologies, and the lead company here, interestingly, is Rosatom. This is the Russian nuclear, civil nuclear engineering conglomerate. It's an absolutely gigantic company, which I believe currently produces something like 40% of the world's nuclear reactors. It might even grow, by the way. I suspect that a very high proportion of the nuclear reactors that Rosatom does not build are actually built in China, just saying. But anyway, Rosatom incidentally also has the lead role in developing Russia's computer industry and in its chips industry. There's been a national program to develop a Russian chip industry, processor industry, and Rosatom is the lead company in this sphere, in this area. There are actually technological reasons for this, which I'm not going to discuss at length in this program, but it is a natural fit to do that. It's a very well organized, extremely well resourced company, very successful in what it has done. So there's every reason to think, by the way, contrary to the endless talk on this topic, that Rosatom will indeed be able to move the Russian computing and chip industries further. And I should say that some months ago, I read a summary of the Russian program for developing, for building up their chip industry. And it was very thorough and very detailed in the way that Russian industry documents often are, and made a very interesting contrast to the US's so far entirely unsuccessful attempts to rebuild its home-produced chip industry in the United States. But these are topics I'm not going to discuss further in this program. Suffice to say that in terms of Russian-Indian cooperation, we have a statement like this. This is from Rosatom's press service. A new area of mutual interest in quantum technologies. Rosatom and Indian companies are actively studying the prospects for cooperation in the field of quantum computing, including the creation of quantum computers. In 2024, Rosatom plans to launch a 40-qubit quantum computer. I'm not going to discuss what that is. Those who have more understanding of technologies and technological matters than me can discuss that. But anyway, and a service to provide cloud access to created quantum computers using quantum algorithms. And we're told that in 2023, quantum computers were successfully tested on 4 advanced technology platforms, including 25-qubit atomic and 20-qubit ion quantum computers. Now, people who understand more about that than me can discuss all of this in detail, but I do understand that the Russians are looking into quantum computing, and there was a recent scare story, I remember, in the American media, that the Chinese had forged ahead in quantum computing and were ahead of the United States in this field, and that this was creating some panic and alarm in the United States, which I don't propose to discuss either. But anyway, all kinds of plans, programs, ideas from the Russians and the Indians. And the plan is, as I said, to bring up Russian-Indian trade to a level of $100 billion turnover fairly soon. And then, of course, to push it further and beyond that. Now, I'm going to make a guess that a lot of people are going to say that these plans are overambitious. Actually, I correct that, it's $200 billion turnover. A lot of people are going to say that these plans are overambitious, that they're not going to work, that the Russians and the Indians have incompatible technologies and incompatible economies. I can remember 10 years ago, all sorts of people saying, in fact, the same people essentially saying exactly the same things about Chinese-Russian trade. At that time, as I remember, there was a plan to increase trade turnover between China and Russia to $200 billion a year. And I remember reading lots of people, clever people, explaining why that would never be achieved, that it was fanciful and far-fetched and fantastic. And, well, suffice to say that that level has already been surpassed. Now, of course, saying that the Russians and the Chinese managed to develop massive and very successful trade relations with each other, which are growing and continuing to grow very fast, does not mean that Russian-Indian trade will follow the same trajectory. As many people have pointed out, the Indian economy and the Chinese economy are profoundly different things. India, for example, is not a manufacturing colossus in the way that China is. In fact, I understand that the share of industry and manufacturing in the Indian economy is actually slightly declining, or has slightly declined over the last few years. But no doubt synergies will be found. In fact, I'm sure they will be. India also has strong potential, in my opinion, to be a very significant producer of light goods, handicrafts, high-end consumer goods, all sorts of things. And I would have thought that given Indian prowess in technology matters and fields like mathematics, which of course the Russians are historically extremely strong in as well, Indian-Russian cooperation on computers is certainly an interesting prospect. Whether, as I said, it will all come together, we shall see, but those who discount that idea might find that events overtake them and that they could be faced with a major Russian-Indian economic tie-up which will surprise and astonish and dismay them in a couple of years, in exactly the same way that the Russian-Chinese tie-up dismayed them as well. Now, the two other great powers, the United States and China, have reacted very differently to this news, this Indian-Russian summit. Now, the Chinese have shown extreme relaxation about this. Global Times has written a piece saying that the way in which the Russians and the Indians are forging their relationships confirms the declining influence of the United States and India's determination to assert its own independence, which is, I think, entirely true, by the way. The Chinese, not at all fazed by the fact that their Russian friends are working to develop a good relationship with India. On the contrary, I think the Chinese quietly are pleased that this is happening. They would rather that Russia maintained strong relations with India than that the relationship between India and Russia were to collapse, creating a situation where India might drift fully into the arms of the United States. So I think the Chinese, on balance, in fact not on balance, they're quite clearly signalling the fact, are actually fairly relaxed and even pleased that this meeting is taking place. And of course it's not as if they've been frozen out in any way. A lot of people have been talking quite properly about the huge summit meeting between Modi and Putin and their respective delegations, which have taken place in Moscow. And they've ignored the fact that even as Putin was receiving Modi, the Russian government in Moscow was also receiving a very important Chinese visitor. And I provide the statement from the press service of the State Duma, Russia's parliament, They said on Tuesday, July 9th, Chairman of the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress, that's to say the Speaker of the Chinese Parliament, Zhao Lezi, arrived in Moscow. Zhao Lezi was met at the gangway by First Deputy Chairman of the State Duma, Ivan Melnikov. And then the press service goes on to say that on Tuesday evening, Zhao Lezi and Chairman of the State Duma, Vyacheslav Volodin, held an informal meeting during which they visited important Moscow landmarks. A bilateral meeting between the head of the Duma and the head of the Chinese Parliament is going to be held today, as well as a 9th meeting of the Interparliamentary Commissions on Cooperation between the Russian Federal Assembly, that's the Russian Parliament, and the National People's Congress. On July 11th, 12th, Zhao Lezi will also take part in the BRICS Parliamentary Forum in St. Petersburg, where, of course, the Indians will also be represented. Now, I believe I am right in saying that Zhao Lezi is also a member of the Standing Committee of China's Politburo. If he is not a member of the Standing Committee, he probably is a member of the Politburo itself. So he is a senior Chinese visitor to Moscow. Now, perhaps the fact that the Russians are hosting a top official from China at the same time as Putin is hosting in Moscow Narendra Modi is an attempt by the Russians to maintain a balance between China and India, to reassure the Chinese that Russian-Chinese relations are not going to be affected by these developments with India. But frankly, I think that is actually unlikely. I think that the Chinese are very well informed about all of the steps that the Russians are taking in relation to their relations with India. I don't think the Chinese, as I said, are particularly concerned about them. And, well, there is a BRICS Parliamentary Forum scheduled in St. Petersburg starting tomorrow. So that's reason enough for Zhao Lezi to go to Moscow at this particular time, become better acquainted with his opposite number in Russia, Vyacheslav Volodin, tour the sites, meet other important people in Moscow, so that these two institutions, the Russian Parliament and the Chinese Parliament, get to know each other better. By the way, it has been a long-standing lament of mine, just saying, that West European parliaments, the parliaments of Britain, France, Germany, Spain, and Italy, and arguably the US Congress, have never reached out and established person-to-person contacts with senior members of the Russian Parliament. I think that for parliamentarians of various countries to meet and to understand how each side works and to get a proper feel for the sort of work that they each do is a very important part of diplomacy. It greatly broadens contacts between countries and means that they're not just confined to government contacts, but no Western country, no Western parliament has ever shown any interest in doing that, because none of them take the Russian parliament at all seriously. So the Chinese are doing it, the Indians are doing it too, but the Europeans and the Americans never have, and as a result, they are even less informed about currents of opinion in Moscow than they should be. I would point out that one of my most useful and, shall I say, respected sources. One of the people who has provided me with the most valuable information over the course of my making of these programs is somebody who makes a point of finding out what sort of discussions are taking place both formally and informally in the State Duma, and doing that has helped me to get a clear understanding of how Russian policy and Russian thinking on any number of topics, but of course especially Ukraine, is developing. So anyway, very important meeting between the Russians and the Indians, and the Chinese are relaxed about it. The Americans are not. They've taken it extremely badly. Apparently, they're particularly annoyed that Modi chose to visit Moscow at the same time as the NATO summit meeting in Washington is underway. The Americans appear to believe, and apparently some people in Europe appear to believe, that the timing of Modi's visit to Moscow was deliberately scheduled to happen at the same time as the NATO meeting, presumably in order to highlight the fact that, contrary to what is being said in the West and at the NATO summit meeting, the Russians are not politically or diplomatically isolated. Well, that might be the effect of Modi's visit, but to be frank, I think that, again, the Americans and the West Europeans are massively exaggerating their own importance. They assume that the Russians and the Indians do everything in response to what they themselves do. So presumably the idea is, the thinking is, that because NATO is holding a summit meeting in Washington, the Russians and the Indians say, ha, this is our chance to spoil the NATO party, so let's have this massive meeting between Putin and Modi and agree all of these important things there. And it's all really been done to basically show to the Americans how little we think of them. As I said, that's a foolish way of thinking. I think that the reason why Modi visited Moscow now is because it fits in with his schedule. He's just won an election in India. He's been engaged over the last few weeks in difficult but successful coalition talks with the other parties of the represented in the Indian Parliament. He now leads a stable government, of which he appears to be in full control. The relationship between India and Russia is becoming more and more important to both of these countries, and so it makes complete sense for Modi to go on and travel to Russia. By the way, I ought to say that after his trip to Russia, I understand that Modi anyway went on and travelled to Europe, and I believe that he is currently in Austria. So it's hardly as if he was snubbing the Americans or the Western powers in any way. Anyway, we had all kinds of sour and grumpy comments from the Americans. We've heard there's news that the Americans have been in contact with the Indians to try to understand why the Indians would want to go to Moscow at this time. All they have to do, by the way, is read the public communiques and the various statements that had come out of the Moscow visit, and they would find it all there. There's no reason to badger and criticize and investigate the Indians to find all that out. And of course, doing all of that, all it's going to do is cause annoyance in Delhi, which I would have thought, from an American point of view, it would be better not to do. But anyway, we've had all sorts of sour comments like that. And consistent with these sour comments, an article appeared a couple of days ago in the Financial Times, a loyal handservant, by the way, of the Biden administration, in which it was explained that the real reason why the Indians were going to Moscow, well, it was not about the Russians so much, it was about China. India does not supposedly want to cut the Russians adrift, because if they did, then Russia would fall completely into the arms of China. Well, there may be some element of that, but again, that discounts, or rather refuses to address, the importance of the economic relationship between India and Russia, and of the deep historic friendship that has existed between these two countries, which is, by the way, uncontroversial in both. So anyway, there we are, a successful and important summit meeting between India and Russia, one which develops further Russian economic ties, and of course facilitates Russian economic development, but which, it is important to say, does the same for India too. India now has a reliable supplier of energy in the form of Russia. The Russians, by the way, have recently concluded a whole set of agreements with the Taliban in Afghanistan. They seem to be busy engineering a rapprochement with the Taliban. And I've no doubt that the reason that they're doing that is because they too eventually plan to create pipelines to supply gas and oil to India by land. And of course, they would need to do that across Central Asia. And of course, Pakistan, just saying, but Afghanistan also as well. And the result is that the Taliban are being brought in from the cold. Another move, by the way, in which the Russians are supported by China. So anyway, an important summit meeting. The NATO summit meeting, by contrast, continues along its path, and as I predicted, there's already been strong statements from Western leaders, primarily and principally President Biden, about the actions, the bad actions that the Russians are taking in Ukraine and elsewhere, and the need to continue to provide unstinting support for Ukraine. And Biden, again, made statements about how the Russians were facing strategic defeat in Ukraine, a fantastic claim, given the realities on the battlefronts, which we will come to shortly. But of course, he also announced a military aid package. And in particular, he said this: "Today, we are announcing that collectively we are providing Ukraine with additional strategic air defense systems, including additional Patriot batteries donated by the United States, Germany, and Romania. Patriot components donated by the Netherlands and other partners to enable the operation of an additional Patriot battery." In other words, there's going to be a Frankenstein Patriot battery created out of component parts of various Patriot systems donated by the Netherlands and other countries, Israel perhaps, and an additional SAMP-T system donated by Italy. Now, Italy, to my knowledge, has already donated 2 SAMP-T systems. And again, according to my knowledge, it originally had 3, and I've not heard that it has procured any others. So if my understanding is correct, and I accept that perhaps it's not, But if my understanding is correct, then the Meloni government is supplying to Ukraine, or has over the last few months supplied to Ukraine, Italy's entire ballistic missile air defense systems. All of its SAMP-T systems have been shipped to Ukraine, where one, at least, has already been destroyed. So there we go. And then Biden went on to say, in addition, in the coming months, the United States and partners intend to provide Ukraine with dozens, note the word dozens, of tactical air defense systems. Now, that all sounds very impressive, but I've made comments in recent programs about how all of these Patriot missile systems and NASAM systems, and IRIS-T systems and SAM-T systems and other systems that the West has provided to Ukraine don't seem to be achieving very much. That the events, the pattern of the Russian missile strikes suggest a complete collapse of Ukraine's air defense system. And, well, I've noticed that no less a person than Julian Röpke, German journalist writing for Bild Zeitung, fervid supporter of Ukraine, has made exactly the same point. He appears to have counted the number of KH-101 missiles, subsonic, air-breathing cruise missiles that pounded the Artyom factory in Kiev in broad daylight the other day. And I counted 3 and thought there might have been 4. He says there were 5. 5 of these missiles penetrated Ukrainian defenses and smashed the factory and must have done huge damage to it. And Röpke makes exactly the same point, and this is, I believe, on X. This statement can be found on X. He makes exactly the same point that I have done, that there is no sign at all of any effective air defense from the Ukrainian Patriot missile batteries located around Kiev. And Röpke also made exactly the same point as the one I have made, that this can only mean one of two things. Either the Patriot missiles are ineffective, perhaps because the Ukrainians have run out of missiles, or in the alternative, as a result of an earlier missile strike carried out by the Russians several hours before, in the early morning, in the hours of darkness. Those Ukrainian Patriot air defense missiles and other air defense missiles in and around Kiev, that they were destroyed by the Russians as well. And by the way, and on that topic, there are reports now starting to trickle in that there have been very heavy casualties amongst Ukrainian air defense personnel. And apparently there have been complaints about this, that a lot of these air defense personnel were killed in circumstances that apparently have infuriated various Ukrainian commentators. I'm not going to get into the details of this because I simply don't know. But anyway, the point to make is that one way or the other, despite constant efforts by the Western powers to build up Ukraine's air defenses, efforts which have been underway, should be said, since the spring of last year, in other words, for over a year, the Russians are able to launch more and more missiles at Ukraine, and more of these missiles are getting through. And now the Russians are able to target positions across Ukraine in the daylight hours and inflict colossal damage upon the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians are being submerged. They're being drowned out. Now, since I'm back to the topic of the missile strike on Kiev, and by the way, there have been more missile strikes by the Russians against various targets in Ukraine since then. Anyway, since I am talking once more about the missile strike, the Russian missile strike on Kiev, I really do feel I have to say something more about the missile hit on the children's hospital. This has become a huge story in the West. There's been endless comments about it. The former British Prime Minister Gordon Brown has written an angry article about it in The Guardian. Let me reiterate again, the Russians deny that it was one of their missiles. They're saying that it was a NASAMS missile, Norwegian-produced NASAMS air defense missile that crashed into this building after failing to intercept any one of the Russian missiles. I've said already, I've seen pictures of the alleged missile that hit this hospital in flight. I want to say alleged because I don't know that it actually was that particular missile. And if the missile indeed was a KH-101, as the Western media are claiming, in other words, a Russian air-launched cruise missile, well, this missile in that photograph, to me, does not look at all like a KH-101. So I just want to make that point. But the key point is that we have a set of conflicting allegations here. The Russians are saying one thing, the Ukrainians are saying something else. The way to find out is through a proper investigation. There has been no investigation. Based on that photograph, I think the evidence tends to support what the Russians say, but I'm not going to claim that that view of mine is in any way authoritative or conclusive. I think that, as I said, an investigation is needed, and I am very, very troubled indeed by all of these people who have written angry articles and made angry assertions all across the media in the West and various Western officials who state something which is only alleged, specifically that it was a Russian missile that hit this hospital, that stated as if it was a proven fact when it obviously is not. Now, let me also just say that just a few weeks ago, 2 or 3 weeks ago, there was I think it was less than that, about a week ago, 10 days ago, there was an explosion of an ATACMS missile above a beach in Crimea, where there were all sorts of beachgoers, civilians. Cluster munitions fell on the beach, and there are lots of film of this. Several people were killed, civilians were killed in that attack. And as I remember, the Western media said virtually nothing about it. There was hardly any comment and certainly no criticism of Ukraine, and barely any comment about the fact that there were also criticisms by the Russians of the United States, and that the Russians actually called the American ambassador in. And going back further still, a couple of months ago, I remember that there was an alleged missile strike, an Israeli missile strike on a hospital building in Gaza. There was a huge amount of argument and about this particular missile strike. whether it was an Israeli missile, whether it had hit the hospital, whether it had hit a parking area near the hospital, whether it was an error, whatever it was. And, well, lots of people said that one should not rush to conclusions about that particular missile strike, which is a sensible position to take. But again, with this missile strike on the hospital in Kiev, all of that, of course, has gone out of the window. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about this incident. I don't propose to return to it. But the key point is, Italy is being stripped, as far as I can tell, of all of its air defense missiles. Probably the Netherlands also. Germany is now losing more and more Patriot air defense missiles. One might assume that these Patriot air defense missiles that are being supplied to Ukraine have actually made a substantial difference to the outcome of the war. And yet, though the West has been supplying Patriot missiles and NASAMS missiles and IRIS-Ts and other systems ever since the spring of 2023, they have not. On the contrary, Russian missile strikes are becoming more, not less, effective. Now, some famous person, there's never full agreement about who that person was, is supposed to have said that doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result is a clear symptom of madness. Well, maybe not of madness, but isn't that exactly what the West, what Biden is doing by getting all of these Patriot missile systems and SAMP-T systems and other systems to Ukraine? Doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. And, well, it's not, of course, just Patriot missile systems, it's every other Western weapon system. When is the penny going to drop that none of this is working? All it is doing is that it is prolonging the war and causing more people to die and causing Ukraine to be further devastated. There's reports that the energy system in Ukraine is now in such a critical condition that come the winter, there is not going to be enough electric power to keep consumers warm, civilians warm, and that there is already insufficient electric power in Ukraine to ensure that the refrigerators in people's homes work properly so that food is being spoiled. I mean, that is the situation. Bear in mind that when, back in the spring of 2023, there was a united decision by the West to provide Ukraine with air defense systems, it was justified at that time by the need to protect Ukraine's energy system. Well, that clearly hasn't happened. All the thermal power stations have been destroyed. The Russians are now coming after the transformer stations, and they've shown that they have the ability to destroy them at will. And, well, Ukraine's energy system today, after all those Western air defense systems were sent to Ukraine, is in a far worse state than it was when the decision to send those air defense missiles was first made in the spring of last year. Now, Biden then, of course, goes on to say that the West will provide Ukraine with dozens of tactical air defense systems. Well, if you follow what Zelensky says, Ukraine doesn't need dozens of these systems. It needs hundreds of them. Ukraine is one of the biggest countries in the world. It is the biggest country in Europe after Russia itself. The extent of the missile system that would be needed to provide full coverage for Ukraine would be colossal. And a couple of dozen tactical air defense systems that Biden is talking about is not going to provide it. And of course, it's not as if the Russians cannot defeat these systems and cannot destroy these systems, which in fact they regularly do. Now, as I said already, this is not just a problem about air defense systems. It's a problem with many other types of weapons as well. And there has been an absolutely devastating article provided now by Radio Liberty, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, in other words, by an American government-funded radio stations and media outlet, which has, of course, passionately supported Ukraine. And this article has looked into the topic of shell production, ammunition production, 155 millimeter shell production in Europe. And it's come to some extremely interesting conclusions. And it has said, briefly, that the Europeans have been giving completely wrong information. I'm being very, very polite here. Wrong information about the level of their production of shells. And it says things like this. In March, the European Commission said that thanks to its measures, European annual production capacity for 155 millimeter shells had reached 1 million a month earlier. That's in February 2024. 3 months later, in June, Thierry Breton, the European Commissioner for the internal market, said that EU producers would reach an annual capacity of 1.7 million 155 millimeter shells by the end of this year, and that capacity would continue to grow. However, according to a high-ranking European arms industry source, the current capacity is about 1/3 of this. It's a very bad idea to convince ourselves that we have 3 times the actual production capacity and make decisions based on that. That is the understatement of the age, by the way. But anyway, to continue. Then suddenly to find out that nothing is coming out of the factories and you cannot supply NATO and the Ukraine and the NATO alliance. Like some others cited in this report, the source spoke on condition of anonymity due to the sensitivity of the subject, which is, by the way, very telling in itself, that admitting to the reality that Europe is producing less than 1/3 of the number of shells that it claims it will be producing by the end of this year, that can put you at risk if you come out and say it openly. Well, anyway, but we go on to read. This testimony aligns with that of 2 other knowledgeable industry sources. Journalists spoke to in June, high-level officials in an EU country and in Ukraine who assess annual capacity of European 155 millimeter ammunition production just over 500,000. Not 1 million, not 1.7 million, but just over 500,000. Declarations of EU leaders regarding 155 millimeter production capacity that is to be reached by the end of this year are not reasonable. Production increases across Europe are lagging behind, with the current total capacity reaching about 580,000 shells per year, said a well-informed artillery industry source from Slovakia. Slovakia, by the way, has inherited part of the once mighty Czechoslovak armaments industry. The former Czechoslovakia used to be the military-industrial hub of the former Habsburg Empire. It was then brought under the control of the Germans in the 1930s and played a very significant role in the German war economy during the Second World War, very much, by the way, against the wishes of the people who worked for it. And then during the era of the Warsaw Pact, the former Czechoslovakia was a major producer of military equipment, including shells, but also trainer aircraft like the L-39 Albatros jets, and artillery and small arms and every kind of weapon system that you can. Anyway, the former Czechoslovakia played a key role in that. And the Czech Republic and Slovakia especially, still have inherited that role, making Slovakia to this day a significant producer of artillery and shells. And of course, just to remind everybody, it was chemists in the former Czechoslovakia who developed the famous Semtex military explosive. Anyway, to continue. Two other documents estimate European industry's annual capacity as of the beginning of the year at not much higher than 500,000. According to a December 2023 Estonian Defence Ministry report, EU production capacity is about 600,000 shells a year. This fits with German arms maker Rheinmetall's January 2024 estimate, an internal document the journalists obtained, which says that all Western European arms makers taken together could produce, that's a very big difference from saying that they are producing, could produce around 550,000 shells annually as of the beginning of this year. And I'm going to say that I think this is probably the absolute uppermost level of production that the European industry is currently capable of. Between 500 and 600,000 shells a year. Not 1 million, not 1.7 million. It will take years before those sort of production numbers are achieved. And we go on to read that Ukraine, that's nowhere near enough for Ukraine. The current need for Ukraine is 200,000 shells a month, according to Defense Minister Rustem Umerov, which is more than the United States and the EU combined can manage. Far more. The United States perhaps produces or will produce by the end of 2025 somewhere in the region of 700,000 shells a year. But it's not producing that number of shells. At the moment, it will only achieve that figure if the new factory that has just been built and opened, well, when that factory reaches its target production figures of 30,000 shells a month. Now, the US, the military in the US, expect that to happen by the end of 2025. All I will say is that I think that is extremely optimistic for a completely new factory with a completely new workforce operating new and unfamiliar machine tools and without perhaps established processes of production. I'm not saying it can't be done. I'm going to say that I have some industrial experience, and I would say that it was a very great stretch that that might happen. At the present time, US production of shells is perhaps around 40,000 a month in a good month, probably less than that in other months. And it looks to me as if the Europeans, for their part, are producing similar quantities of shells at the moment to the United States. If they gave all their shells, all the shells that they're producing to Ukraine, it would still not provide Ukraine with as much as half the shells the Ukrainians say they need. Now, Russian production numbers, according to perhaps the most reliable estimates, speak of Russia producing 4.5 million shells by year end. And of course, if it's true that North Korea is providing Russia with another 5 million shells, well, you start to see the problem. Now, of course, it must be said that there are other estimates for Russian shell production. One recent estimate I saw put it much lower at 1.7 million shells this year. I think most people who've looked at this consider that is much too low, but that is still more that is being produced by the combined West. In fact, I think it is much more than that, and I think the events on the battlefronts effectively confirm this. And, well, shell production is a very bad state in the West, and I want to say again, I think that between 500,000 and 600,000 shells a year is the absolute limit of what European industry can produce. To expand beyond that would require not only massive investments, but huge training, retraining and organization of personnel. And the same is true of production numbers in the United States. I suspect that we're going to see production in the United States finally hit the 700,000 a year target, probably in around 2 to 3 years' time. And I doubt that European industry can grow much beyond its current levels. So maybe around 1.2 million shells, certainly not just 1.7 million shells from the Europeans alone by the end of this year. Just saying. Now, why then are we getting these completely false numbers? Why is the European Commission talking about 1.7 million shells when the real number is between 500,000 and 600,000? I'm going to suggest a simple reason, which is that there is right across the industry a pervasive culture of lying. The political leaders insist that the industry do the impossible. The industry is very reluctant to tell the politicians that what they are demanding is impossible, because doing so might lead to all kinds of difficult questions. So everybody pretends that the actual production numbers are much higher than they really are. It's when investigations are done and people look below the statements that the truth emerges. And if anybody knows anything at all about corporate culture in the West today, anybody who knows that would know how common a problem this is, how pervasive the culture of lying within Western corporate structures has now become. Anyway, let's move on. Shell production, very bad. I couldn't help but cannot help but point out something else which has come out of this particular article, which brings me back to my old friend, President Pavel of the Czech Republic, and his brilliant plan, announced to huge amount of attention just a few months ago, to try and find shells on the international arms market. Now, there have been already admissions from all sorts of people that the project to find shells on the international arms market has not actually delivered anywhere near as many shells as had been expected. I, of course, always said that would be the case. I always said that the arms dealers around the world would rub their hands with glee at President Pavel and his officials coming with deep pockets, demanding shells wherever they could, that they would immediately increase prices, and that the shells that would be provided would still be far fewer than the 800,000 that President Pavel was looking for. And, well, I also said that many of those shells that were eventually found would turn out to be duds. And we've had articles now, lots of articles, which in fact confirm that all my predictions on this topic have turned out to be true. Now, I remember way back, I think in May, that we were hearing from the Czechs that nonetheless some shells had been found, 100,000 shells would in fact be delivered from this project to Ukraine in June. And what do I now read? In February, this is in the same article, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. In February, President Pavel said the Czech Republic had identified 800,000 artillery shells that could be quickly directed to Ukraine if there was money. Notice the word quickly. But progress has been slow, and a high-ranking Ukrainian Defense Ministry source said the first shipment, which arrived in June, consisted of fewer than 50,000 shells. So, President Pavel has not found his 800,000 shells. A few weeks ago, he was promising the Ukrainians 100,000 shells in June, and he's actually provided them with fewer than 50,000. A lot of people around the world, in Africa, the Middle East, Latin America, wherever it was that he bought these shells from, must be very, very happy. They must be laughing all the way to the bank. And all I can say is, I feel, in light of what I previously said, that I'm entitled to the small chuckle myself. It bewilders me. It absolutely baffles me that these people, the leaders of the West, can be so disconnected from reality, so profoundly ignorant of the way the world works. And speaking of the way the world works, we've now had a report in Bloomberg that the Saudis warned the Europeans some months ago that if they actually did confiscate Russian assets in Europe, that the Saudis would start pulling their own assets out of Europe. That's actually a fairly old story, but it's interesting that it's been repeated. And apparently it was the single thing, the warning from the Saudis, that gave the Europeans cold feet. And there's also a report that the Biden administration has vetoed a plan by the Sanctions Office of the US Treasury to impose sanctions on Russia's shadow fleet of oil tankers. Sanctions which, by the way, would not stop Russian oil exports, might interrupt their flow slightly, but it would certainly not end the Russian oil trade. But again, I'm going to say straightforwardly that the real reason that this was done was not the reason that is being cited, that the Biden administration doesn't want to see an increase in oil prices in the run-up to the presidential election. The real reason it was done was that sanctions of this kind would have infuriated various other important oil producers, the Saudis being amongst them, and of course it would have infuriated the international shipping industry. So the Saudis almost certainly put the kibosh on that particular plan as well. And of course, it's important to say that one of the key reasons the Saudis had been taking steps to distance themselves from the Americans over the last months, one of the reasons why they're joining the BRICS, sending massive delegations, military delegations to China, as they've just done, by the way, to source arms there, entered into a oil alliance with the Russians, agreed a rapprochement with the Iranians. One of the reasons why, the main single reason why the Saudis are doing all of this is because they are furious over the American and Western decision to try to impose an oil price, a price cap on Russian oil exports, thereby, in effect, reducing the global oil price had that price cap actually succeeded. So, again, further example of how the great leaders of the West, the movers and shakers, the masters of the universe in their own self-conception, actually don't understand properly how the world in fact works. Anyway, let's now go to that perennial topic, which is the military situation in Ukraine. And I noticed, by the way, the President Biden again spoke about the Russians having suffered 350,000 casualties. This has been a major stumbling problem for the West, because the only real survey on Russian losses, the one that actually aggregates Russian losses properly, which is the Mediazona project, has simply not been supporting these claims. In fact, what it has shown is that Russian losses have been on a declining trajectory ever since the end of the Battle of Bakhmut last year. And in fact, Russian losses over the last few weeks and months, basically since the summer, that last summer, have declined to a steady trickle. I don't want to understate the tragedies, the individual tragedies of these losses, by the way, but they certainly are not the devastating losses that some people in the West say. Now, these losses are based on open source material. Mediazona looks through all the death records, the monuments, the funerals, those kind of things, and it provides an estimate based on these numbers, always saying that its estimate is probably around 15 to 20% below the total figure. And on that, it has been saying that Russian losses, total Russian losses, rather mortalities, Russian soldiers who've been killed over the period of the special military operation, number somewhere between 60 and 70,000. That's their current estimate on that basis. Well, this has obviously displeased some people. I suspect Mediazona has been under a great deal of criticism for some time. It has a relationship with the BBC, and the BBC, of course, is close to the British authorities. So Mediazona has now decided that it will recalculate Russian mortalities, not by simply going out and putting together figures based on actual data, but on the basis of estimates produced by some kind of algorithm. So it's moving from a position where it is reporting actual information to a position where it is basically speculating on the strength of an algorithm. I find this very sad. I hope that Mediazona nonetheless continues to provide the raw figures, because it is the raw figures that, in my opinion, are the only reliable ones. Now, if you want a full and detailed discussion of this whole topic, the right place to go is to Simplicius the Thinker's blog on Substack. He's just done a very fine piece explaining both the original reliable methodology used by Mediazona and the new, entirely new methodology which is replacing it, which of course brings Russian casualty numbers into line with those that the Western powers want them to be. Just as we have been given completely wrong information about European artillery shell production by orders of magnitude, so I'm afraid we're now going to be given completely wrong information about Russian casualties, again, by orders of magnitude, all of which comes together and provides a completely distorted picture of the actual state of the war. Well, what is happening in the war? Well, very briefly, it looks as if Ukraine is now facing a major operational crisis in Volchansk. Now, it's difficult to get an exact picture, but we now have significant film footage and photographic footage which shows heavy fighting going on between the Ukrainians and the Russians south of the Volcha River in Volchansk. So the Russians presumably have captured the entire territory in the loop of the Volcha River south of the aggregate plant. I am assuming that they have captured the aggregate plant themselves, though it is important to stress that they have never said that they have done so. It looks to me as if they are in the process of clearing the area of the high-rise buildings further north, where the Ukrainian troops are now completely cut off. And having achieved all of these successes, the Russians have now crossed the Volcha River in some force, nobody knows exactly how great, and are now operating south of the Volcha River in southern Volchansk. Now, it's important to say that we've had reports like that before, but this time the presence of Russian troops in southern Volchansk and fighting in southern Volchansk is confirmed by the Ukrainians themselves through their various mapping projects and in photographic and film evidence. We don't know much for the moment about the direction of the battle, but to repeat again, Ramzan Kadyrov just the other day said that the Russians were on the brink of capturing Volchansk, and it looks as if that is the picture that we're being presented with today. Now, further west, the Ukrainians have made inroads into the village of Gluboka, near Lipsy, where they're being bombed and pounded and shelled and mortared by the Russians. There's a sort of wedge that they have managed to achieve within Gluboka. But to be frank, I have to say that seems to me an insignificant secondary theatre, an attempt to capture a small village, even as they are losing just a few kilometers further to the east a major town. Now, let's wait and see what happens in Volchansk, but all of the information points, as I said, to a decisive breakthrough by the Russians in Volchansk. There have been other reports from other places as well. It seems as if the Russians have now resumed military operations of some kind around Kupiansk itself, near the village of Sinkovka, where the front lines have been stable for many months. Further south, in the area of the Zherebets and Oskol rivers, it seems as if the Russians are now in occupation or soon in occupation of Pyshanya, and there are reports that the Ukrainian troops who were previously defending Pyshanya have again basically fled from the town, that they have abandoned their positions there. We're getting more and more reports of this sort of thing happening in all sorts of places. Further south still, Russians apparently have broken into Makeyevka near the Zherebets River. Perhaps more importantly, Denis Pushilin, the head of the Donetsk regional government, has now made statements which appear to suggest that the Russians expect to capture Chasiv Yar fairly soon. He's not provided a huge amount of information about this, but he says things like this: Chasiv Yar is important for us, just as for the enemy. The reason is that it is the key to a wider area. It will enable us to think and make decisions about which direction to move in, from Druzhkova to Slavyansk. In between, there are Konstantinovka and Kramatorsk. So this is what Pushilin said, speaking on Russian television, and it's Soloviev Live TV to be precise. So those words strongly suggest that Pushilin believes that with the micro-district captured and with the Russians west of the micro-district to the north and south of Chasiv Yar, the major battle for the rest of Chasiv Yar is about to begin, and that the Ukrainians won't be able to defend themselves for very long there. There are lots of reports, by the way, of the Russians heavily bombing Chasiv Yar, Ukrainian positions in Chasiv Yar. Further south still, the Russians not only have been making more advances in New York, a village near Toretsk. By the way, the Russians call it Novgorodsky, and I presume this is the name the village will have once again after it has been brought fully under Russian control. Anyway, the Russians have made further inroads into New York. My sense is that they now control more than half of the village, and there are some suggestions that the village, the entire village of New York, one of the most heavily fortified positions in the entire area, the entire Toretsk area, is about to fall. But the big operational crisis for the Ukrainians, more so perhaps for the moment than what's happening in Volchansk and Chasiv Yar, though the Chasiv Yar situation could become very critical for the Ukrainians very soon. The big operational crisis for the Ukrainians seems to me to be in the Ocheretino, Avdiivka area. The Russians, so the reports say, have successfully broken into the village. Well, they seem to be clearing the village of Yevgenivka. The Ukrainians supposedly have abandoned it. They've reached another village to the east of Yevgenivka called Vovche. Vovche is located immediately to the south of Progress. And as I discussed in my program yesterday, it looks as if the Ukrainians are withdrawing from Novoselivka Persha, and the Russian Defense Ministry has confirmed that the other village of Yasnobrodovka, further south, has now passed completely under Russian control. If you start to look at a map, you start to see how critical the whole situation for the Ukrainians in this area has become. The Russians are now very close to three of the major logistical hubs of the Ukrainian army in Donbass, three key cities, three key towns where the Ukrainians receive equipment from the West so that it can be transferred to the Ukrainian front lines further east. These are the towns of Kurakhovo, Selidovo, and Pakrovsk. And all three of these towns are now, in my opinion, within long-range artillery fire, tube artillery fire, of the Russian military. Once the village of Progress is captured by the Russians, I think beyond any question, Pakrovsk will be well within Russian artillery fire, just saying. But, if the Russians manage to move even further west, the villages along the next village on the road from Progress is a village called Grodivka. The Russians reach that village and capture that village, then, the situation will be in crisis for the Ukrainians in Pakrovsk, and Mirnograd itself certainly well within artillery range at that point. But if the Russians manage to establish themselves in Novoselivka Persha and move along Novoselivka Persha and complete the capture of Karlovka further to the south, they are also within easy artillery range of Selidovo, and they are already, it seems to me, with the fighting that's going on in Maximilianovka further south, they are already within artillery range of Kurakhovo itself, though the major battle for Kurakhovo will presumably begin only after Krasnogorovka has finally fallen, which the Russians, I suspect, are deliberately pacing themselves in Krasnogorovka in order to get all of their various positions aligned on the other battlefronts. They need to clear all of these other villages first as well. And further south still, the 79th Brigade, the querulous, bad-tempered, but nonetheless still very courageous 79th Brigade, which has been defending places like Novomikhailovka, Paraskovyevka, and Konstantinovka. Well, they're now saying that the Russians have, in effect, cut the road from Konstantinovka to Vuhledar, that the Russians have actually managed to insert troops, actually occupy the stretches of the road. This puts the Russians, by the way, well ahead of positions shown by the various mapping projects, both pro-Ukrainian and pro-Russian, and also neutral. But anyway, that's what the 79th Brigade says, and I assume that what they're saying is true. So we can see that the Russian offensive continues to grind on further to the west, and the Ukrainians show no ability, no capacity to resist it or to slow it down. Well, there we are. What the NATO powers are going to do, I have no idea. But the level of denial about everything on the part of NATO, about the state of the military situation, about the production numbers of artillery shells, about the effectiveness of air defense missiles, about the effectiveness of the ATACMS missiles, I haven't discussed that in this program, remains astonishing. And when one gets so much wrong information circulating, it's unsurprising that disastrously bad decisions continue to be made. I read an article somewhere, I think it was in Politico, which admitted, they had high administration officials, Biden administration officials admit that the Ukrainians were still losing ground and would continue to lose ground for some time. But these same officials expressed sublime confidence that the situation would be stabilized when more Western equipment arrived and that all would be well in the end. It was acknowledged that there was no prospect of Ukraine recovering all of its lost territory, returning to the 2014, 1991 borders. But they would be able to keep the Russians back. And for that reason, it was impolitic to start negotiations now because the stabilization of the fronts needed to take place first. Now, I remember other articles in Politico. I remember one in Politico from the summer of 2022 saying that the US was absolutely sure that the provision of Western weapons to Ukraine would enable the Ukrainians to prevail and that the United States would be able to counter any number of weapons that the Russians deployed in Ukraine. That was in 2022. And look where we are now. We go from the sublime and factually misplaced optimism of 2022 to the sublime and factually misplaced optimism of 2024. In fact, the situation is deteriorating all the time. And there must be no negotiations, apparently, so that the opportunities for negotiations are being thrown away. And instead of Ukraine negotiating, whilst it retains residual strengths, the situation will inevitably develop to the point where Ukraine will negotiate from a position of further weakness. Well, there it is. I've said enough on this program. I'm going to stop here. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Don't forget to check out our shop where you will find all sorts of amazing things, including our continuing Football 24 series. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.